you'll see that I added the rest of the RotoPaint nodes that we needed just to kind of finish off getting rid of those stairs, or rather the railing for the stairs over here that we could see, kind of fix the bottom of this cliff here in the background, and also this little piece that kind of drops down kind of at the bottom of that piece. So let's go ahead and jump into our 3D view now that we kind of see what those RotoPaint nodes changed, and take a look at making this geometry look more believable. So I'm going to stop the playback and we'll jump over to our 3D view. You can also just hit the tab key while hovering over the viewer. And I think, let's actually take this cylinder here, and I'm going to hold down Control and kind of rotate it a little bit better over to the side. That way we kind of see more of the texture here. That may have been just a little bit too far. Maybe more like right there. Perfect. So now we're kind of seeing more of that texture, but we also are seeing sort of this very straight looking edge of our cylinder. And so what's happening with that is our picture is just being projected onto that very smooth geometry, and we're seeing the effects of that smooth geometry and just kind of almost looking like our cliffside has been clipped. And that's not what we would want. It's not very believable that way. What we can do is add the DisplaceGeo node to start breaking that geometry up and making it feel a little more jagged, like a real cliff would look. So what we can do is just hover over our empty area of the node graph, hit the tab key, and type in dis, and that's going to bring up DisplaceGeo as one of your choices. So go ahead and click that, and to use it, we'll drop it on our pipes after our cylinder. So I'll just place it right there, and you can see that automatically is going to plug in, but we don't see any kind of change. So the reason for that is because we need to plug it into some sort of information that can displace it. Now we can't just plug it straight into the cylinder. You can see it won't allow me to do that, but I can plug it into my pre-molt node, and you can see that when I do that, it's going to be using the color information from my picture. So you can see that like some of these areas here that have maybe a brighter look to them are going to be displaced more. So the brighter the color value is, the more displacement we get. So this area up here where it's lighter at the top, we get more displacement. Same down here at the bottom where the light's really hitting those. They're really kind of sticking out more than the darker areas, like over here where it's still feeling very, very flat because of how dark it is. So that is really going to help that look more realistic. However, if we jump back over to our 2D view, I'm just going to hover over this area and hit the tab key. You can see it's a little bit extreme. So we're getting a little bit too much displacement almost, and it's starting to kind of stretch and look like it's too much. So if we come over to our DisplaceGeo node, you can come in and start to turn down the scale, and then you can really see how the profile of that begins to change. Now you may say, okay, that looks pretty good, but some of these areas just feel still like it's not really doing enough. This just feels like a really big spot that it just kind of pulled out. And if we look at the 3D view, if I come back over here, we can see the geometry. When we click on this, we can see that wireframe, and it's really not very detailed. So if you want to change that, you'll actually want to go into your cylinder to add more faces. Now you want to be careful that you don't crank it up too high, or it's going to take a long time to render. So we have that sort of mitigated by the fact that we're projecting a texture on here. We don't actually need the geometry there to show us all of these little pieces because it is a picture being projected. But just to get a little bit more realistic definition, you can go into that cylinder by opening it up over here in your properties bin and adding to your rows and columns. So let's say I change this to about 50 by 50. You can see that I get more geometry, and therefore it's going to be a little bit more precise with the areas that it's pulling out with the DisplaceGeo node. So let's jump back over to our 2D view, and you can see that slight change as the scanline render kind of moves through here, really starts to make that look more realistic. And now those polygons are more the size of those little kind of jut out pieces in our rock face, and it just starts to look more realistic. Here we're still getting just not quite enough, so maybe let's try turning this up to about 70 by 70. You can see the smaller, the more rows and columns you add, the smaller those areas get, and the more realistic it continues to look. Again, the more you increase it, the more your render time is going to go up, but it's worth it to get that really realistic looking deformation. So let's go ahead and maybe turn down our DisplaceGeo scale just a little bit further, just kind of right in there. And then let's try this out on a few other pieces. So I'm going to go back into my 3D view, and let's try it out on these pieces back here. So one of these, let's go ahead and just copy that DisplaceGeo node since we know we're kind of happy with its settings. I'll hit Control C, Control V, drop it on this pipe right here. Okay, so we're looking at this cylinder. We have DisplaceGeo turned on here, and to actually displace it, we'll want to plug it into our pre-mold. And you can see we get just a little bit of displacement there along those pieces. It's not a huge amount, so if you want to, you can come in again to the DisplaceGeo and start to turn up that scale. But again, remember, the more we add it, the less realistic it's going to look. This one is farther in the background, so it is not going to be as obvious, so you may need a little bit more on those types of pieces. However, it's almost doing the opposite of what we want. You can see that the area that would be farther away, the sky, appears to be closest to the camera, and that's just because that's how it's working. It's got those lighter areas. It's based on the luminance values. So what we can do is offset this in the Z axis. So if I come in here to the offset and go to the Z, let's just try putting in a -1, and you can see that kind of just takes it back to 0 almost. So we're not getting displacement anymore. So let's try a -2. And you can see now it's basically doing the same displacement, but in the opposite direction. So now it's moving inward instead of outward. So that's going to help that to just look a little bit better, a little bit more realistic. I also want to add just a little bit more dimension to this cylinder. Not a lot. I don't want to increase my count so much on my rows and columns that I really hurt my render time. So again, I'll just do 50 by 50 for that. And then let's do the same thing for this other one right here. So I've got this cylinder. We're going to do 50 by 50, and we'll go ahead and grab our DisplaceGeo with the settings that have that offset in them. We'll just grab it and hit Control C, Control V, drop it on after our cylinder, and then plug the displacement into our pre-mold. Great. That's looking really good. Maybe almost a little bit too strong, I might say. So instead of doing a whole -2 for our offset, let's just try a 1.5. That's better. Not quite so extreme that way. This one had a few more white values, so that's probably why it was so much further. Okay, so that's looking good. One other thing that I'd like to do just to kind of clean up here in the node graph is to add a dot node so that this isn't overlapping. So if I hold Control, I can just grab this and add a little dot over to the side so that we can see the DisplaceGeo has to bypass the cylinder and go into the pre-molt for its displacement. And we'll just add that for our other pieces, just to keep that relationship clear for the displacement. Just like that. Okay, that looks a lot cleaner. Great, so let's move on to our next lesson where we're going to be doing just a little bit more cleanup and final positioning for our cards and cylinders. Maybe I'll even add in a few more displacement nodes. You can try it out on some of your other pieces of geometry. You can do it on a card just as easily as you can do it on a cylinder. So maybe if you want to try it out on the sidewalk here, or maybe even this piece over here, just see how it looks, see if you like it, and play around with it on your own. So we'll come back in the next lesson, kind of get the final position of everything in place.